Veteran Ethan Walker thought this winter had brought him peace. But on a hushed patrol beneath the snow-covered firs, that belief was broken. His German shepherd Riley stopped dead ears pinned high, his breath a visible tremor staring into a part of the woods Ethan had long avoided. An instant later, Riley bolted, dragging Ethan toward a ravine where no human tracks had appeared since the spring thaw. What they found wasn't born of the earth, but was made of metal, ancient and cold. It jutted from the ice like the spine of some long-dead beast that was better left undisturbed. And as Ethan swept the frost from its steel hide, the entire mountain seemed to hold its breath, for the secret sealed within that wreckage had never truly been asleep. And the men who buried it were already returning to finish their work. We hope you'll support us by subscribing to the channel. The winter night fell heavy across the Cascades, the very air a razor that threatened to cut exposed skin. Inside the UH-60 Black Hawk, as it sliced the darkness, Emily Carter was held captive, her wrists and ankles tightly bound. Her back was pressed hard against the cold metal floor. At 31, Emily possessed a quiet strength forged by discipline and by loss. Of medium height, her lean, athletic form was a product of federal training. Her dark brown hair, once a tight braid, now showed the signs of her struggle, and her deep, hazel eyes were sharp enough to unravel nearly any suspect she questioned. Years in federal law had etched a quiet resilience into her expression, but tonight that hardened mask was beginning to slip. Bruises marred her cheekbone, the price she paid for refusing to give up confidential intel just hours before. Beside her lay Ranger, her 5-year-old K9 partner. This German shepherd was large for the breed, with powerful, broad shoulders, a thick winter coat of sable black and tan, and intelligent amber eyes that were constantly assessing the threat. He was trained for search, rescue, and high-risk takedowns. Yet his greatest gift was a deep empathy. He sensed Emily's terror before she uttered a single word, tail pressed firmly against the deck, a low, anxious rumble echoing deep in his throat. Surrounding them were 3 men in unmarked tactical gear, their faces hidden by black helmets. They said little, but their every move betrayed their nature. Precise, clinical, and rehearsed. These were no mere criminals. These men were professionals, the kind hired to make problems quietly vanish. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight and dry from gulping the frigid, thin air. Her mind spun, desperately grasping for protocols, escape techniques, any negotiation strategy, anything that might offer a handhold for survival. But the truth was cruelly, devastatingly simple. Her hands were bound, her weapons were gone, and Ranger, her devoted partner, had been drugged and was only now starting to fight off the lingering effects. The lead operative stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw shrouded by the dark shadow of several days' growth. Even with the helmet on, he radiated a heavy, worn-out aura, someone who might have once believed in a cause, but had long since buried it under layers of violence for hire. Emily knew he had military training. The rigid precision of his movements told her everything. His voice was flat, empty. "We're approaching the drop." Drop, that one word sent a chill of ice straight down her spine. Her breath hitched. "You don't have to do this," she stated, her voice low yet unwavering. "If you need information, we can talk. But killing a federal officer? Not killing. Cleaning up," he interrupted, his voice like ice. With a curt nod, a second operative moved in, severing the rope that bound Ranger to the wall. The shepherd let out a low growl, disoriented but fiercely protective. A cold panic constricted Emily's chest, her mind desperately screaming for a plan, for any kind of leverage for an escape. But all she had was Ranger's trembling body pressed against hers and the frantic pounding of her own heart in her ears. The helicopter's side door slid open with a hungry groan, unleashing a glacial blast of wind that clawed viciously at her exposed skin. Icy snowflakes shot sideways into the cabin, stinging like 1,000 tiny shards of glass. Beyond the door, the horizon was a consuming void of white and black, where immense mountain shadows were devoured by the endless night. Rough hands seized her arms. Emily fought back a desperate thrash born more of instinct than hope, her muscles screaming beneath a surge of fear and adrenaline. Ranger lunged with teeth bared, a loyal protector to the last, but a heavy boot brutally pinned him to the floor. "Please," Emily choked out her plea, not for herself, but for Ranger. "He's just a dog. He's innocent." For the briefest of moments, the tall operative hesitated. Something flickered behind the soulless black visor. A sliver of a human reaction, buried deep but not yet extinguished. Then it was gone as quickly as it came. He sliced her harness strap in one swift, brutal motion. The world tilted beneath her. Ranger let out a raw, desperate bark, the sound of a loyal animal sensing the nightmare just before his human did. Then 2 sets of hands shoved her into the abyss. The world fell away. A scream died in her throat, the rushing air tearing it from her lips before it could ever take form. The cold slammed into her like a solid wall, instantly numbing her skin and burning her lungs. Ranger was a tumbling shape beside her, his limbs flailing wildly as they plummeted together through the suffocating darkness. The wind roared with a violence that drowned out all thought. Emily forced her arms wide, twisting her body in mid-air to reach for Ranger. Her tactical winter jacket, a heavy Federal-issue coat with reinforced fabric, billowed out, catching the air and slowing their fall by the smallest fraction. It wasn't a parachute, but it was a chance. She snatched Ranger from the air, pulling him into her and wrapping her body around him, angling herself to take the brutal brunt of the impact. Branches exploded into splinters around them as they crashed through the treetops. A white-hot, blinding pain shot through her shoulder as bone met force and cracked. Ranger let out a sharp yelp. The world became a chaotic blur of flipping and slamming before the cold finally swallowed them whole. Then they hit the snowbank, a deep, forgiving pocket of powder hidden beneath the pines. The impact violently drove the air from her lungs, but it had saved their lives. Emily lay buried in the silence, her ears ringing, vision swimming, the metallic taste of blood on her tongue. Ranger whimpered against her chest, alive but clearly in pain. High above the helicopter's fading rotor was consumed by the vast winter silence. They had survived the impossible. But their ordeal in the freezing heart of the Cascade Mountains was only just beginning. The storm crept through the valley like a great, prowling beast, driving sheets of blinding snow between the towering pines that guarded Ethan Walker's solitude. At 43, Ethan possessed the quiet strength of a man who had weathered more winters, both in the mountains and in his soul, than he cared to count. He stood a solid 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders beneath a worn flannel jacket, his beard streaked with iron gray around a jawline forged by years of discipline. His deep-set blue eyes, though often calm, held a shadow that never fully retreated. It was the ghost of a mission gone wrong 15 years ago, a disastrous night raid in Kandahar, where he'd lost 2 of his men. From then on, he had chosen the hush of the wild over the clamor of society, with only the ancient trees as silent witnesses to his sorrow. Ethan was mending a fractured window pane when the sound first reached him, a percussive chop of helicopter blades slicing through the storm's fury. It was a sound that didn't belong tracing a flight path he knew was wrong. And then a sudden soul-jarring crash echoed from deep within the woods. He went still, every dormant instinct from his years as a ranger blazing back to life. Dakota, his old husky mix, raised his head from the hearthrug. At 12 years old, Dakota was built leaner than most of his kind. A silver-coated frame with 4 white paws and a muzzle grayed by time. But despite his years, his watchful, amber eyes still burned with the unyielding spirit of a working dog. A low bark escaped him, a perfect echo of the sudden tension in Ethan. "Yeah, boy," Ethan whispered, pulling a heavy-duty flashlight and his bolt-action rifle from its place on the wall. "We're going out." He zipped up his insulated coat, the cold air lunging at him the second he cracked the cabin door. The wind flung snow against his face. Dakota pushed forward, his gait aged but his purpose unwavering. Ethan plunged after him into the blinding white. The woods became a labyrinth of sound and stillness, the gale tearing at noises and twisting them into ghosts. But Ethan knew how to read this language, the snap of fresh broken branches, the subtle shudder in the air, even the sharp scent of overturned snow. His eyes swept the valley below until they locked onto it. A raw wound in the earth, a crater of shattered pines, and fresh powder a half-mile from his home. Dakota whined, surging ahead. Ethan closed the distance, his movement swift but wary. The air caught in his throat at the sight. A woman half swallowed by the snow was ensnared in a web of splintered limbs. She seemed impossibly delicate against the unforgiving frozen ground. Her face, which hours before might have held strength and confidence, was now a canvas of pale skin and blue-tinged lips. Snowflakes dusted her dark braid, a smear of dried blood marking her temple. Her jacket was shredded, and her left shoulder was twisted at an impossible angle. She couldn't have been much older than her early 30s, but it was her eyes. Even closed, they held a power that disturbed him. A tension in her brow spoke of a battle still being waged deep within the darkness of unconsciousness. At her side lay a German shepherd, its hind leg bleeding onto the snow, but it fought feebly to rise. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound aimed not at Ethan, but at its own pain, a flicker of protective fire, refusing to be extinguished. Ethan lowered himself to one knee, showing empty hands. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low, calming current. Dakota remained behind him, tail low, but intrigued. The shepherd's ears flickered. It took in Ethan's scent, then sank down beside the woman once more. "She's your partner," Ethan breathed. "All right, we'll do this together." He found the woman's pulse, a faint but steady rhythm. Her badge hung from a ripped loop on her vest. Emily Carter, federal officer. Federal. That meant this was more than just a crash. It meant trouble, and that trouble could be heading right for them. He carefully slid his arms under her, feeling the protest of broken ribs as she stirred with a faint whimper. A small, sharp breath of pain escaped her lips, but she didn't surface. Ethan drew her gently to his chest. She was lighter than he'd imagined, as if the impact had shaken the very life force from her bones. Next, he gathered the dog into his arms, which whined softly, but offered no resistance. The shepherd was a heavy burden, but it was a weight his body knew, a memory of carrying wounded brothers from the field. A merciless wind tore at them as they fought their way toward the cabin. The snow fell harder, their world shrinking to a small circle of light from Ethan's beam. Every few steps, he swept the tree line, a reflex forged in years of war. Paranoia was survival. Tonight it was a gut-wrenching certainty. They had been thrown from the sky. No one survives a fall like that by chance. And those who deal death from above never leave loose ends. Inside the safety of his cabin, Ethan gently placed Emily on the bed and the shepherd by the stove. Dakota paced nervously, nudging the wounded dog before lying watch. He carefully removed Emily's gloves to check her fingers. They were ice cold, but not yet lost. He worked with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much and knew the cost of every second lost. He fashioned a makeshift sling for her shoulder, then gently cleansed the dried blood from her temple. He felt her ribs. 3 of them at least were broken, and bound her torso as gently as he could. Only once did she stir, her eyelids fluttering. "Ranger?" She breathed the name, a fragile prayer. Ethan glanced at the shepherd. "He's right here." "Whoa, he's safe." A single tear escaped, not from weakness, but a relief so profound it could shatter a hardened soul. Then the darkness took her once more. Ethan turned to Ranger, who met the antiseptic with a weak, pained snarl. But Ethan just murmured, "Easy now, soldier." And the noble dog allowed him to clean and bind the deep wound. Ranger's breathing finally steadied. Ethan leaned back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and let out a single shuddering breath. Then came a sound far colder than the storm, the thud of distant rotor blades. Faint yet unmistakable carving through the storm above the valley. The ones who dropped them were coming back, and they were not coming back to rescue anyone. Emily woke to the scent of pine and wood smoke, a warmth she hadn't felt since before she fell. Her eyelids felt heavy as ice-caked branches, the blurred shape of a log ceiling slowly coming into focus. The steady crackle of a fire whispered from a nearby hearth, and for a moment she surrendered to the illusion of safety before reality hit like a punch to her already broken ribs. She struggled to sit up, pure panic seizing her heart. Ranger, where was Ranger? Her pulse hammered in her ears, raw terror slicing through the fog in her mind. A steady voice cut through her rising panic. "Easy, you're safe here." The voice was Ethan Walker's. He sat in a worn wooden chair by her bed, his broad shoulders slumped in a protective watch. There was a surprising gentleness in his deep-set blue eyes. His face was still rugged, gray-bearded, and stern, a map of sorrows he never spoke of. But right now there was no threat in him. Emily's breath hitched. "Ranger, my dog, where is he?" "He's over there," Ethan said, nodding his head toward the fire. Ranger was resting on a quilt near the fire, his leg wrapped in a thick, clean bandage. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Dakota sat guard beside him, the old husky's tail thumping a soft, reassuring beat. Emily sank back into the pillow, the crushing weight of fear finally lifting from her weary heart. Tears pricked at her eyes, not from weakness, but from a gratitude so deep it hurt. She had braced herself for the end. Ranger, her partner, through hellish raids, blazing shootouts, and frigid river searches. And now this. She swallowed hard, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Ethan just nodded once, a silent pact that some debts need no words. But her composure vanished as a memory clawed at her mind. Hands grabbing her, a cold blade cutting through straps, the cold darkness swallowing them whole. The helicopter, the operatives, the sickening fall. A violent shiver racked her body. Ethan noticed. "Want to tell me what happened?" Emily hesitated for a moment. Her training screamed caution. She didn't know this man. But the throbbing in her ribs, the cabin's warmth, and Ranger's steady breath beside her, all of it screamed that without him she'd be frozen solid in the snow. And something in his gaze, steady, unblinking, yet not demanding, told her that he'd seen enough betrayal to respect the truth when he heard it. She drew a shaky breath. "It all started 3 weeks ago. My task force got intel on a weapons ring, moving military-grade hardware across 5 states. We thought it was just another cartel spin-off, but it wasn't." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Who was running it? Marcus Hale. The name alone seemed to poison the quiet cabin. Ethan frowned, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Marcus Hale," she explained, "was a decorated army captain once, tall, sharp features, oozing confidence and charisma. But under that polished surface was a deep rot festering for years from cutting corners and betraying anyone for a price. Hale stood around 6'2", with cold gray eyes and a calculated charm that made people trust him. Right before he destroyed them, he left the military under a cloud of unofficial misconduct. No, and simply took his talent for military tactics to the black market. His moral compass was so broken that human lives became just variables in an equation. Her voice faltered as she went on. "We found proof, hard proof, that he was moving prototype firearms, the kind stolen directly from a government contractor. So weapons that make soldiers disappear, not just hit targets." The memory of finding that final piece of proof flashed in her mind. Hale's encrypted ledger. It listed payments to mercenaries, pilots, smugglers, and a separate category labeled cleanup personnel. Her stomach twisted into a knot. When he knew I had the files, she shut her eyes, the image flooding her mind. Hale's thin, cruel smile stung, the cold metal of the cuffs the needle pressed against Ranger's fur. He sent a team posing as a federal extraction unit to bring me in. My own task force thought it was a legitimate transport. Ethan's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under his beard. The betrayal was familiar, almost too familiar. And instead of transport, they took me up into the mountains, cut the harness, and pushed us out. Her voice cracked. They didn't want a body discovered, just a neat story that nobody questioned. Snow hissed against the glass, and a long silence stretched out between them. Emily looked at Ethan, a new sharp fear burning in her hazel eyes. They'll come back. They will track the fall. They don't leave things undone. Ethan stood up, his entire posture shifting, the caretaker melting away to reveal the soldier. It was a subtle shift, yet impossible to miss. A tension in his shoulders, a grounding of his stance, a reawakening of abilities long dormant in his isolation. In that single breath, he was no longer merely a secluded craftsman. He was the ranger he once was. Then we prepare, he commanded, his voice dropping into a low, unshakable register. When Hale's men arrive, they won't expect resistance, but make no mistake, they won't leave until they are certain you are gone. Emily swallowed hard. Her ribs ached, her limbs trembled, but her mind grew sharp as glass. I can help. I'm injured, but not helpless. Ethan gently shook his head. You're staying inside. You and Ranger both. This snow gives us cover, but it gives them the same advantage. I know their tactics. He lifted his rifle from its hooks, expertly checking the chamber. Dakota moved to his side, sensing the dangerous shift in the air. Emily watched him, seeing not just a loner, but a man forged by sorrow, now driven by something that felt dangerously like purpose. Why are you helping us? She whispered. Ethan paused at the door, his hand resting on the latch. His voice was quiet, but it was edged with a fierce resolve. Because someone once left me to die in the snow, and I swore no one I could save would ever suffer that fate. The wind outside rose in a long, mournful howl. The hunters were closing in. The storm had died to a whisper as Ethan moved to extinguish every last light in the cabin. Darkness folded around them, heavy and expectant, as if the forest itself felt new predators moving through its frozen heart. Ethan knelt beside Emily, who leaned wearily against the wall, one arm cradling her bandaged ribs. Ranger lay beside her, breath shallow but alert, his ears twitching at every distant crack of ice. Dakota paced in tight circles, a nervous energy coursing through his aging frame. We move now, Ethan murmured. Before they grid-searched this area, Emily's voice was strained but resolute. How many will Hale send? Enough to guarantee you never testify. Ethan slung his rifle over his back and pulled open a hidden trapdoor in the floorboards. It revealed a narrow crawl space leading to a dark passage. Come on, it's an old hunting tunnel that runs downhill. Quiet and cold, but safe for a half-mile. Emily followed him down the ladder, wincing with the sharp pain in her ribs. The tunnel was cramped, framed by decaying timbers and frozen earth. It smelled of old metal, deep pine roots, and forgotten time. Ethan led on with a small, red-filtered lantern. Behind him, Ranger limped but kept pace, and Dakota stayed close, occasionally nudging the shepherd with gentle reassurance. As they emerged into the open valley, the world was a sculpture of silver, with moonlight spilling over snow-heavy branches, frost glittering like broken stars. Ethan froze, scanning the dark tree line. Years of combat had honed his senses into something almost primal. He breathed in the night air as if it carried whispers no one else could hear. We have to break their trail, he whispered, moving with swift, sure-footed precision, sweeping snow with a pine bough to cover their tracks, then breaking branches to create a false trail. Emily could only watch in awe, despite the agony that twisted inside her. Ethan didn't just know this land. He became one with the forest, its curves and shadows his only allies. But the hunters were closing in a relentless, encroaching force. Miles distant, Vern Talbot, the local tracker Hale had brought in, knelt at the precipice where Emily and Ranger had plunged into the abyss. Vern was a raw-boned man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of cracked leather, carved by decades of brutal winters, his gray-blonde beard coarse as wire. His left eye was a milky orb, the ghost of an old hunting accident that had stolen his sight, but honed his other senses to a razor's edge. The folks back in town claimed Vern could track a single snowflake through a blizzard. He moved now with that same chilling precision, cracking a sliver of ice in his palm. He lifted a faint smear of dried blood from a pine branch. She's alive. Vern rasped, his voice a low gravel shaped by whiskey and long years of solitude. The dog too. Behind him, two of Hale's mercs stood like statues of death, masked and armed, their rifles held at the ready. One of them, a man with a shorn head and a wicked scar bisecting his chin, spoke with a sharp edge of irritation. You sure about that Hale figured they'd be gone for good? Vern pinned him with his one good eye. Blood's fresh. The prints are staggered. Someone carried her. Someone with real strength. He gestured to the misshapen boot prints. Wide gate, dug in deep, that's your man. Hale's going to want a confirmation, the scarred man shot back. He'll get it, Vern grunted. And you boys keep your fingers off those triggers until I give the word. Deeper in the woods, Ethan was setting a snare in the snow. A thin wire stretched taut in the deep shadows where the moonlight could not penetrate. His hands worked with a silent, lethal efficiency. Nearby, Emily sagged against a pine trunk ranger, a warm, solid presence pressed against her side. They'll be on us fast, Ethan said, his voice low. They'll assume the fall finished you, but once they find these tracks, they'll come on even harder. Emily stared at him, her breath a white cloud in the freezing air. You're putting your own life on the line. For me. Ethan never looked up from securing the final knot. It wouldn't be the first time I've made that kind of mistake, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But the bitterness in his voice was a blade turned inward, not meant for her. Suddenly, Dakota's ears shot up. A moment later, Ranger let out a low growl. A branch cracked in the darkness to the east. Down! Ethan hissed, his voice a whip of sound. He yanked Emily down behind a fallen log, just as a silenced round whispered through the exact space they had occupied a heartbeat before. Ranger lunged, a blur of protective instinct, but Emily caught his scruff. She held him back, with every last ounce of her failing strength. Dark shapes were ghosting through the trees, 3 men spreading out in a practiced tactical formation. The faint gleam of their rifles cut through the gloom. Their movements were far too disciplined, too precise for ordinary hunters. Vern Talbot materialized from the shadows behind them, his posture deceptively casual, like a wolf waiting. The tracks end right here, he announced, his voice a low rumble. They're close, hunkered down. To Emily, Ethan silently mouthed the words, "Move on my signal." The lead mercenary stalked forward right toward Ethan's hidden snare. His boot snagged the wire, unleashing the violent crack of a bent sapling as it whipped upward, slamming him brutally off his feet. The man hit the snow with a choked cry. Ethan fired a single clean shot, and the mercenary went still. Ranger erupted in a sharp, defiant bark. It drew the fire. The second merc pivoted his rifle, finding the dog. In that instant, Emily didn't think. She only acted. Ignoring the fire in her own body, she threw herself sideways, shielding Ranger with her own weight as the bullet cracked violently into the snow right beside them. Ethan was already rolling behind a tree, firing again. The second mercenary collapsed into the snow. Through it all, Vern Talbot never even flinched. He took one step back, leveling a long-barreled revolver with a hand as steady as stone. Wounded Ranger struggled back to his feet. A low snarl ripped from his chest, a promise of defiance despite the pain. Vern steadied his aim, and then Dakota, old and tired, but fueled by a lifetime of loyalty, launched herself between them. Snarling with a primal, unexpected ferocity, Vern froze for a heartbeat just long enough. Ethan fired. The tracker dropped to one knee, his hand clutching his arm as a blossoming crimson stain soaked the snow. "This is over!" Ethan roared. "Move!" He seized Emily's arm, shouldering her weight as the wounded ranger hobbled faithfully behind them. Takakota stayed close, his tail tucked low, but his spirit unbroken. Gunfire echoed like ghosts as the remaining mercenaries scrambled to regroup. They plunged into the moon-drenched woods, the terrain falling away steeply beneath them. Ahead beyond the tree line, a stark, jagged cliff line cut against the horizon. It was their only chance, the one place he could get a radio signal, and a fortress Hale's men would be hard-pressed to trap them in. The wind grew teeth as Ethan fought through the last stretch of the trail, each blast carrying tiny daggers of ice that bit at their exposed skin. The cliff rose before them, a jagged crown in the fading moonlight. Emily was a fragile weight against his side, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, yet her will held firm. Ranger limped beside her, his wounded leg carving a painful furrow in the snow, but he refused to be left behind. Dakota scouted ahead, a bristling sentinel, his senses screaming for any sign of threat. "We're almost there." Ethan said a promise meant more for her heart than his own. His voice carried a raw, steady tone, but the hard line of his jaw betrayed the truth. At the precipice stood a relic, an old metal radio mast, a lonely, rusted skeleton bolted to the rock, half consumed by decades of unforgiving frost. He'd put it there himself a lifetime ago for backcountry emergencies, back when saving lost souls in the wild still felt like a calling. He hadn't laid a hand on it in years. He shed his pack, his hands pulling out a portable transmitter. Military surplus, scarred but dependable. His gloved fingers flew a blur of motion as he connected the wires and spun the frozen dials. Through a haze of pain, Emily watched him, awed by the practiced calm born only of brutal training and deeper sorrow. Asterisk. Can it still work? Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk? It has to. Ranger nudged her, a silent plea to hold on. Emily's trembling fingers found his fur, tracing the outline of his ears, as a fresh wave of agony shot through her ribs. But the steady warmth of her loyal friend anchored her to the moment. Ethan flipped the final switch. A violent crackle of static tore from the speaker, a cold, empty sound that squeezed the air from her lungs. "Come on, work," he muttered. Then a ghost of a hiss, a shattered syllable, the barest promise of a voice. "Control. Respond. State emergency. Identify." A spark of impossible hope ignited in Emily's eyes. "They hear us." But before Ethan could answer, a low, menacing growl rumbled from Dakota's chest. Too late. Dark shapes were moving on the ridgeline, silent, methodical, fanning out like a wolf pack. 4 mercenaries materialized from the tree line, their rifles already shouldered, and behind them, stepping into the ghostly half-light, was Marcus Hale himself. Hale was just as Emily remembered, tall, broad, with a chilling, predatory calm that promised violence. 40, perhaps, but it was arrogance, not years, that had etched the lines on his face. His dark hair was shorn short, his jaw sharp as a shard of ice. His eyes, a cold, metallic gray, held nothing, no doubt, no remorse. He was a man long accustomed to walking over the wreckage he created. His breath plumed in the frigid air as a cruel smirk twisted his lips. "I should have known a ghost like you would try to drag her back from the dead. Walker!" Ethan moved a fluid motion that put his body squarely between Hale and Emily. "You want her? Then you'll have to go through me." Hale let out a cold laugh, utterly devoid of humor. "Always playing the hero. Or maybe you just have a soft spot for broken things." Emily's jaw tightened. The words hit their mark like daggers, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The first shot rang out, kicking up a spray of ice just inches from Ethan's boots. Emily fell to one knee, fighting the fire in her ribs as she raised the sidearm from Ethan and squeezed off a single steady shot. The mercenary crumpled. Ranger's ferocious bark made the next attacker freeze as Dakota surged forward, jaws snapping at his leg, giving Ethan the one opening he needed, dragging Emily to the safety of a boulder as gunfire erupted, tearing the night apart in violent strobes. Ethan fired back, taking down a second man, but Hale moved with a lethal grace, flanking them behind a snowdrift with short tactical bursts. The suppressing fire pinned them. A low growl rumbled in Ranger's chest, and he moved to charge. "Stay." Emily's whisper was a desperate command, her hand tangled in his fur. Ranger obeyed her, though every muscle in his body quivered with the instinct to defend her. Ethan knew they were being cornered. He drew a breath, his heart beating a familiar, wild rhythm. It was the cadence of survival, an echo from a life he'd left behind. and then Hale stepped into the open. His rifle was leveled right at Ethan's head. "End of the line," he declared. A scream ripped from Emily's throat as Ranger launched himself forward, but Hale was quicker. He pivoted the rifle to end Ethan first, just as a deafening roar shattered the winter air. A federal helicopter tore through the storm clouds, its searchlight a blazing star cutting through the gloom. The remaining mercenaries scattered, momentarily blinded. Hale recoiled, throwing an arm up against the intense beam as the helicopter descended, hovering low. Its rotors churned the air, blasting the cliff with a turbulence that threatened to send them all tumbling. "Federal unit!" a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons." Hale's eyes were slits of pure, cold fury. He made one last move toward Ethan, but Ethan didn't wait. He surged forward, driving his shoulder hard into Hale's chest. The two men grappled desperately in the deep snow. Two souls forged in violence, their paths colliding here on the very edge of the world. Hale threw a punch, grazing Ethan's cheek. Ethan threw him down, slamming him onto the ice as the searchlight pinned them like specimens. Hale snarled, "You can't stop what's coming." One hard strike from Ethan sent him reeling. Hale's rifle slid away across the snow. The wind howled as his balance gave way. And then his footing was gone. With a crunch of snow, his body hit the ground with a heavy, final thud. Ethan stood over him, his chest heaving, his breath ragged in the frigid air. Moments later, armed agents rappelled from the helicopter, moving swiftly to secure the area. Emily was carefully hoisted in a rescue harness with Ranger, never leaving her side. Ethan was the last one up. Dakota was tucked under a rescuer's arm, a small, loyal soldier who had more than earned his passage. As the chopper ascended into the approaching dawn, the first golden rays of morning painted the snow-covered forest below. Emily reached out her fingers, finding Ethan's, her eyes holding a look that was both fragile and fiercely unbreakable. "You saved me," she whispered. In more ways than one, Ranger laid his head on Ethan's lap, a gesture of absolute, weary trust. Far below them, the storm had broken, and a new day had begun. It was a beginning born from a fall that should have been an end. And in that end, it was more than just courage that saved them. For Ranger and Ethan on that frozen summit, survival felt too perfect to be mere coincidence, an intervention too timely, too gentle, too fiercely guarded. Those who heard their tale later whispered the same profound truth, that a higher power places souls where they must be just at the moment all hope appears to be lost. Perhaps the true miracle wasn't the rescue helicopter, or Ethan's fight through pain and fear, or even Ranger's unwavering devotion. Maybe the true miracle was how 3 broken lives found one another in a storm that should have been their very end. It's a truth echoing in our own lives for the days we feel pushed to the very edge, alone, cold, and overwhelmed. Then help arrives in forms we never expect: a kind stranger, a loyal friend, a moment of pure clarity, a spark of courage in the darkness. So if you're watching, I pray that in whatever storm you're facing, may God's protection be a wall of light around you. May He guide your steps, strengthen your spirit, and remind you that no fall, no matter how terrifying, is truly the end of your own story. If this story touched your heart, please share it, and consider leaving a comment below, and subscribing so more people can feel the warmth of hope in a world that truly needs it. May God bless you, your family, and every loyal companion walking the path beside you. Amen.